One of the things that we talk about a lot too, when you go through a large scale ERP organizational change, it really takes a great deal of creativity and innovation. And I think that, kind of creativity and innovation go hand in hand with collaboration. So can you discuss with our listeners and maybe share your approach to energizing the innovation funnel and fostering collaborative practices within an organization? What would you say about that?
Yeah, and then I'm going to bring up, the role of artificial intelligence and what that can do to, help us. Again, for most executives, artificial intelligence is already a part of our everyday life and what we do. But I've just really been enthralled with ways in which organizations are leveraging that. It's, like a personal assistant, because I think the idea of creating flexible teams that collaborate effectively, both internally and externally with different partners, is real important. And it's a shift. It's a mindset shift. We often are thinking about collaborating within our organization and maybe across functional areas. We're a little more reluctant to think about, the knowledge that exists outside and with other partners or sources that we might have. And so really building out, like designing and like an architect in agile organization, you really want to have a culture that promotes entrepreneurship, innovation, and collaboration. And artificial intelligence can be just a great way to maybe help out with some of the repetitive tasks so that actors or members can pay more attention to the relational and the creative elements, the stuff that we like to be doing, because there's a lot of efficiencies in some of that. It can enhance some of our capabilities and capacity for that.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, to be sure. Yeah, and I would direct our listeners, and we'll put a link in our show notes to Dennison Consulting site. There's a lot of great literature and case studies in papers available to our listeners. But, one of the things with large scale organizational change is just the awareness of the impact that culture has on large scale change, and especially, I would say, ERP organizational change. And I often think, when we go into our projects, that sometimes organizational culture can be a buzzword. And you hear people say it and they talk about it and it sounds nice, but sometimes you just got to get down, as I'd mentioned earlier, to the brass tacks, right? You've really got to understand, what is organizational culture? What does it mean? What does it look like? What are some of the key attributes that really drive that productive workplace and organizational performance? And so, Megs, can you share with our listeners, is there a relationship between a positive culture and high-performing organizations? And how do we know? How do we know that? What's the proof in the pudding there?
Oh, you want to read the end of the book? Yeah, I mean, Dan's whole work, and really, Dan was also back in the 1970s. I don't think he'll mind that I bring that up. The Peters and Waterman idea, this in search of excellence, really trying to find what's the secret sauce and what makes organizations excellent was Peters and Waterman's. Dan's was, is there a way we can identify cultural traits of an organization and connect or correlate those to being a successful or a high-performing organization? And that's the whole foundation of his work. So he started out, it's qualitative case studies, looking at a range. At the time, he was working at the Social Institute research in Michigan, and he just had access to macro databases. And yeah, he was able to find there were direct links between culture and performance. And so the model that he developed with these 4 cultural traits are ways in which you can actually measure those connections between how an organization is aligned and the degree to which there are performance indices. I think additionally, with these key organizational performance metrics, the research has shown there's some specific connections. So for example, let's say the organization's strategy, part of their growth is around innovation. So having a culture that reflects more flexibility versus stability, those are the dynamic tensions in any organization that are out there. So having, more indications around being able to be customer focused, creating change, having a team orientation, empowering, And so along with flexibility, being externally oriented, there's direct correlation. If you have those cultural traits, you have a higher probability of achieving this idea of innovation. Now, for other organizations, being high performing for them might be a high employee satisfaction and low employee turnover. So it's a different type of organization. Let's say it's just, a healthcare organization. They want to retain their top talent. That's one of the pain points right now CEOs have. They want to keep top talent and keep their employees satisfied and keep their talent developing. So the cultural traits for that type of organization, healthcare is a little bit more of a stable industry, and you want to be risk adverse. You want to have low medical error. You want to have low turnover rates. And so some of their cultural traits, they're going to be a little more emphasized on stability and a little more internally oriented. So cultural traits that look at ideas around empowerment, capability development, as well as having alignment around some of those core values. So part of it, Jack, it depends, what's the measure for that organization on being high performing. If their high performance is around ROA, that's slightly different than, being high performing around innovation.
Yeah. Part of the model that you're referring to, of course, is the Dennison model, and it looks at those 4 key categories, right? I think adaptability, mission, involvement, and consistency. And you'd mentioned 12 attributes. And just to share with our listeners really quick, not all of them, but for example, that would be like organizational learning, creating change, team orientation, some of the things we talked about on this call so far, agreement, coordination and integration, goals and objectives, strategic direction and intent, which we talked about a little bit. So those are all very much key attributes and components of any organizational culture. And I think that the degree to which any of those have an impact within an organization, it kind of varies in amplitude, right? So, so clearly every organization has those various attributes, but the amplitude in which those are active, let's say, can vary drastically. And I think that there's plenty of research, and certainly with Dr. Dennison, your team and the Dennison Consulting team, that shows that there's a pretty clear correlation between those attributes and organizational performance. Is that all fair statement if I were to distill it down to that summary?
Oh, Jack, you're making Dan's heart go pitter patter. Yes.
and I can tell you, Megs, from experience, obviously being a big fan of the Dennison model and in our work at Nestell Associates, just anecdotally, there's no doubt about it that the degree in which the amplitude of each of those attributes are higher, the ERP organizational change effort has been not perfect. There's no such thing, but it's certainly been more effective and more efficient when organizations, let's say, score higher in those different areas.
Yeah, I was thinking too, Jack, because we both have this passion around how can we help organizations with their change efforts and with their strategy, and I think particularly with ERP organizations, that can be really complex and challenging. And so some other things we haven't really talked about, but I'm sure the audience is aware of. Now, there's this idea of resistance to change. Yeah. And resistance to change isn't always necessarily a negative thing. There's this idea of ambivalence to change. Ambivalence meaning just not understanding it. There's different levels of ambivalence, like an emotional level, behavioral, and an intentional. And I think really being aware of that early on. And again, it's just, I think as change leaders, that's where we can really help other organizations navigate that. That's a blind spot, I think, for a lot of organizations as they're trying to implement change in an ERP. We've talked already about this cultural shifts, usually roles and responsibilities and workflows, decision-making, that's all changing. Obviously there's some training, and skills gaps, with the ERP, it's slightly different skills, and how you're just thinking about the change management process and making sure that it's vital. You want to minimize disruption, and try and, they talk about managing resistance or just being aware of it. So we shouldn't underestimate the complexity of the change management, having a change management strategy where you communicate, stakeholder engagement, super, super key. Communication, but it's also about understanding and sense making. And I think that would be, Jack, one of the other things that we sometimes see that's, again, there's the communication out, but there isn't the time needed so do individuals really understand how this change is or is not impacting how they go about their work. Are they able to make sense or understand that? And so that sense-making piece is an important part to the change management process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're just barely scratching the surface here, but change management and definitely resistance to change, which, by the way, I've always seen that as a very powerful tool. I don't see that as necessarily a negative thing. I think it's a very, very productive and it can be a very productive and positive tool, when you see that. And often it can bring, new insights to the project, certainly.